The first time Thomas the Duke of Everley saw the woman he had once refused to marry, she was standing in the rain on the steps of a house that did not belong to him, wearing a servant's gown that had been mended at the hem, and holding a child against her hip, as though the weight of the world had been balanced there for so long that she had forgotten how to stand without it. He had come to Norland Park for several weeks of shooting and political conversation, the kind of gathering at which men of his rank were expected to appear, drink claret, and pretend that the business of Parliament was more interesting than the business of their own estates. The journey from Yorkshire had been tedious, the roads rutted by autumn rain, and his carriage had arrived after dark on the previous evening. He had gone directly to his rooms, exchanged a few words with his host, and slept without once thinking of the past. But the following morning, when he had risen early and walked to the window of his bedchamber to observe the condition of the grounds, he had seen her. At first he had not believed it. She was too far below for him to see her face clearly, and the rain had been falling heavily enough to blur the shape of her, so for the space of several seconds he had assumed that his eyes were playing tricks upon him. But then she had shifted the child more securely against her side, tilting her head toward the child as though speaking to it, and he had recognized the small, deliberate gesture of her right hand as she tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. It was a movement he had seen her make many times before, in another life, in another county, when she had been the eldest daughter of a baronet, and he had been the heir to a dukedom, and the world had appeared to hold no possibility of suffering. He stood quite still at the window, one hand braced against the cold glass, and watched her cross the gravel drive with the child. She walked with the same straight-backed grace she had always possessed, but something in her step had changed. There was a carefulness about it now, as though she had learned to move through the world without drawing attention to herself. The woman he remembered had never tried to avoid being seen. By the time she disappeared through a side door beneath the servants' quarters, his heart was beating so hard that he could feel it in his throat. He remained at the window for a long time afterward, staring at the place where she had vanished, while the rain continued to fall, and the lawn beyond the drive turned slowly to mud. She was supposed to be in Scotland. That was what he had been told, in the final letter he had received from her brother, the one he had read twice, and then burned in the grate of his study, because he had not wanted any record of her to remain in his possession. She had gone to stay with relatives in Edinburgh, the letter had said, and there had been no further correspondence after that. He had assumed, in the years that followed, that she had married some respectable Scottish gentleman and settled into a life far removed from his own. He had never imagined that she might be living in service, and he had certainly never imagined that she might have a child. The discovery unsettled him more than he would have cared to admit, even to himself. He had spent nearly a decade teaching himself not to think of her, and he had largely succeeded. His life had become an orderly arrangement of responsibilities and obligations, his time divided between his estates in Yorkshire and his duties in London, his social circle composed of people whose names and faces never changed. He had not married, though there had been 2 or 3 young women whose families had made their hopes known, and he had long ago concluded that he would eventually choose a wife with the same practical detachment with which he chose his horses and his political allies. But now, standing at the window of his host's house, he could not stop thinking of the expression on her face. He had not been close enough to see it clearly, but he had seen enough to know that she had looked tired, more than tired. There had been something shadowed about her, something worn, and the knowledge of it sat inside him like a stone. He told himself that it was none of his concern. He had no right to interfere in her life, and no reason to imagine that she would welcome his interference. The last time they had spoken, she had made her feelings perfectly clear. He could still remember the exact words she had used, and the cold fury in her eyes as she had said them. She had told him that she never wished to see him again, and he had believed her, because Elizabeth Marlowe had never been a woman to make threats she did not intend to keep. So he remained at the window for a long time, and then he turned away, and he dressed for breakfast, and he went downstairs with the intention of pretending that he had seen nothing at all. But the house was not large enough to hide her from him, and by the end of his first day at Norland Park, he had learned more than he had ever wanted to know. She was a maid in the household of Lord and Lady Harrington, a fact that struck him as so impossible that he twice heard it repeated before he could fully accept it. The housekeeper, a formidable woman by the name of Mrs. Bryce, referred to her as Sarah, which was not her name, and spoke of her in the same tone she used for the other servants, as though there was nothing remarkable about her at all. The other maids treated her with a guarded respect, the footmen avoided her, and the cook, when asked about the child, merely shrugged and said that the boy stayed in the nursery with the other children of the household. None of them seemed to know who she really was. Or if they did, they gave no sign of it, and it occurred to him that perhaps she had constructed an entirely new identity for herself, a fiction so complete that even those who lived beside her had never suspected the truth. The thought of it filled him with a strange and complicated emotion that he could not immediately name. There was grief in it, and guilt, and a hot edge of anger that had nowhere to go, because the only person he could reasonably blame was himself. He had been 24 years old when he had first met her, and she had been 19, the daughter of Sir Henry Marlowe, a baronet whose estate lay only a few miles from the northern boundary of his own family's lands. The Marlowes had been country gentry, respectable but not wealthy, and there had been no particular reason for their paths to cross with those of the Everley family, whose title and fortune placed them in a sphere far above the Marlowes' modest aspirations. But Elizabeth's mother had been a friend of his own mother in girlhood, and the two women had maintained a correspondence over the years, and so when the Marlowes had fallen upon difficult times, the Dowager Duchess had invited them to spend a season at Everley Hall. He had not wanted them to come. He had been young then, and proud, and impatient with anything that interfered with his own amusements, and the prospect of entertaining a baronet and his family for several weeks had struck him as a tiresome imposition. He had made his objections known to his mother in no uncertain terms, and she had listened with the same patient expression she always wore when he was being unreasonable, and then she had told him that the Marlowes would arrive on the 12th of June, and that he would be expected to behave with courtesy. So he had behaved with courtesy, in the beginning, because that was what was required of him, and he had fully intended to continue behaving with courtesy until the day he could finally put the Marlowes back into their carriage and watch them drive away. But Elizabeth had made it impossible for him to remain distant. She had not been the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, though she had possessed a kind of quiet loveliness that he had come to appreciate more with each passing day. Her hair had been dark, her eyes a warm brown, her features regular but unremarkable. What had set her apart from every other woman of his acquaintance had been the quality of her attention. When she looked at him, she seemed to see him clearly, without the flattery or calculation that colored so many of his social interactions. She listened when he spoke, and she answered him without coyness or artifice, and she laughed at his jokes even when they were not particularly amusing, and she treated him as though he were simply a man, rather than a duke. It had been intoxicating. He had fallen in love with her so gradually that he had not recognized the condition for what it was until it was already too late to retreat. By midsummer, he had been inventing excuses to seek her out, arranging walks and rides and quiet conversations in the garden, lingering beside her at dinner, and finding reasons to remain in whatever room she happened to occupy. His mother had noticed, of course, and had said nothing, but he had seen the knowing look in her eyes, and had understood that she approved. The Marlowes had stayed for 6 weeks, and by the time their visit ended, he had made up his mind to marry her. He had not proposed immediately. There had been matters to settle first, settlements to arrange, family considerations to navigate, and he had believed that he had time. Elizabeth had returned to her father's estate with the understanding that he would write to her, and he had written often, long letters in which he had discussed the details of his day and asked after her family and hinted at the future he hoped they would share. She had written back with equal warmth, and he had carried her letters in his coat pocket and read them when he thought no one was watching. Then his father had died. The death had not been unexpected. The previous duke had been ill for months, his health declining by slow degrees, and the family had prepared themselves for the loss as best they could. But the title had brought with it a weight of responsibility that his 24-year-old self had not fully anticipated. There had been the funeral, the legal formalities, the inheritance of an estate that was larger and more complex than he had realized, and the sudden, suffocating awareness that every decision he made would now be scrutinized by people who had never met him. And there had been his mother, who had pulled him aside one evening in the weeks after the funeral, and told him, gently but firmly, that the family's financial situation was not as secure as he had believed. The estate was encumbered, she had explained. His father had made a series of investments that had failed, and there were debts that would need to be paid, and the only practical solution was for him to marry a woman whose fortune could restore the family's stability. She had not said the words cruelly, but she had said them clearly, and he had understood exactly what she meant. Elizabeth Marlowe had no fortune. Her father was a baronet whose lands had been sold piece by piece to cover his own debts, and she would bring nothing to a marriage except herself. In ordinary circumstances, that might have been enough. But these were not ordinary circumstances, and his mother had made it plain that the future of the dukedom depended upon his making a prudent choice. He had resisted, he had argued, he had been angry, and then he had been desperate, and then he had been silent, because he had known in his heart that she was right. The estate could not survive without an infusion of money, and there was no other way to obtain it except through marriage. He was the Duke of Everley now, and his duty was not to his own happiness, but to the hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended upon his family's continued existence. So he had done the only thing he could do. He had written to Elizabeth, and asked her to meet him at a posting inn, halfway between their estates, and he had sat across from her in a private parlour, while the rain had fallen outside the windows, and he had told her that he could not marry her. He had expected her to cry. He had expected her to argue, to plead, to demand an explanation. But she had done none of those things. She had simply sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, and listened to him with an expression that gave nothing away. When he had finished speaking, she had looked at him for a long moment, and then she had said, in a voice that was perfectly steady, "I understand." And then she had risen from her chair, and she had walked out of the room, and he had let her go. That had been the last time he had seen her, until now. He spent the first several days at Norland Park in a state of restless agitation, avoiding the servants' quarters and the kitchen garden, and anywhere else he might encounter her, while at the same time, finding his attention drawn again and again to the east wing of the house, where the servants slept and worked. He told himself that he was being foolish, that she would not want to see him, that any attempt to approach her would only cause her further pain. But the memory of her face in the rain haunted him, and he found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had happened to her in the years since he had sent her away. It was Lord Harrington who inadvertently provided him with the opportunity to learn more. The Earl was a genial man in his late 40s, portly and red-faced, with a fondness for hunting, and a tendency to speak at length about subjects that interested no one but himself. He had invited Everley to Norland Park as part of a larger political gathering, and for the first few days, the two men had exchanged little beyond the usual pleasantries. But on the third evening, as they sat together in the library after dinner, Harrington mentioned that his wife had recently engaged a new maid, and that the woman had proved to be remarkably capable. "Sarah, her name is," Harrington said, swirling his brandy, "came to us, with a recommendation from Lady Westmoreland, of all people. Apparently she worked in Lady Westmoreland's household for several years before that. Quiet sort of woman, keeps to herself. But she's been a great help to my wife, I can tell you that much." Everley kept his face carefully neutral. "Lady Westmoreland? Yes. You know her, I imagine. Lives in Bath now, mostly. Her health is poor, and she prefers the waters to the London air. She wrote to my wife last spring, said she had a woman in her household who was looking for a new position, and asked if we might have room for her. My wife was glad of the offer. Good servants are hard to find these days." Everley made a non-committal sound, and took a sip of his own brandy. His mind was working rapidly. Lady Westmoreland was a distant cousin of the Marlowes, a connection that Elizabeth might reasonably have turned to in a time of need. If she had spent several years in Lady Westmoreland's household, that would explain how she had come to be recommended to the Harringtons. But it did not explain why she was working as a maid at all. What had happened to her family? Why had she not married? And whose child had she been carrying on her hip, with that air of weary possession that he had seen from the window? He wanted to ask, but he could not ask without revealing his own interest, and so he remained silent, and let Harrington continue talking. The Earl moved on to other subjects, the prospects for the coming hunting season, the state of the roads, the latest political gossip from London, and Everley listened with half an ear, while his thoughts remained fixed on the woman in the servants' quarters. The following day, he saw the child. It happened entirely by accident. He had gone for a walk through the grounds, hoping that the exercise would clear his head, and his path had taken him past the kitchen garden, where a small boy was sitting on an upturned bucket, picking at the dirt with a stick. The child looked up as he approached, and Everly stopped short, because the boy's eyes were brown and dark-haired, and there was something about the shape of his face that was achingly familiar. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the boy said, in a clear, piping voice, "Are you a duke?" Everly blinked. "Yes," he said after a pause. "I am." The boy considered this information with apparent gravity. "My mama says dukes are very important," he said. "She says I must be polite to them." "Your mama is very wise." The boy nodded, apparently satisfied with this response, and returned his attention to the dirt. He was perhaps 4 or 5 years old, small and sturdy, with a smudge of dirt on one cheek and a hole in the knee of his breeches. His hair was dark and slightly curly, and his hands were grubby, and he looked nothing like a nobleman's son. Everly found that he could not look away from him. "What is your name?" he asked, and was surprised by the roughness of his own voice. The boy looked up again. "Tom," he said. "Tom Bailey." Bailey. The name meant nothing to him. Some part of him had been braced for a different answer, though he could not have said what answer he had expected, and the relief that flooded through him was followed immediately by shame at his own suspicion. Of course the boy was not his. There was no reason to imagine such a thing. Their courtship had been conducted with every appearance of propriety, though there had been moments between them that no one else had known about. And yet, looking at the child, he could not entirely dismiss the thought. "Tom," he repeated. "That is a good name." The boy grinned at him, revealing a gap where one of his front teeth was missing. "Mama says so too," he said. "She says it was my papa's name." Everly felt something twist in his chest. "Your papa," he said carefully. "Is he?" "He's in heaven," the boy said, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who had been told the story many times. "He died before I was born. Mama says he was a soldier." "I am sorry to hear that." The boy shrugged, already losing interest in the conversation. "Mama says it's all right," he said. "She says we have each other, and that's what matters." Everly stood there for a moment longer, looking down at the child, and then he turned and walked away without another word. His chest felt tight, and there was a pressure behind his eyes that he refused to acknowledge. He did not know why the boy's words should affect him so strongly, and he did not want to examine the feeling too closely. But as he walked back toward the house, one thought repeated itself in his mind, over and over, with the persistence of a heartbeat. She had named her son Thomas. It meant nothing, he told himself. Thomas was a common name. It did not have to mean anything at all. And yet it did. He avoided the kitchen garden after that, and he avoided the east wing, and he avoided the servants' hall, and he told himself that he was succeeding in putting the matter out of his mind. But the house seemed to conspire against him, because every time he turned a corner, he caught a glimpse of dark hair or a flash of brown eyes, and every time he heard a woman's voice in the distance, he found himself listening for the particular cadence of her speech. It was absurd. He was a duke, and she was a maid, and there was no possible world in which the two of them could have any meaningful conversation. Whatever had once existed between them was dead, buried beneath years of silence and regret. The woman he had known was gone, replaced by a servant who called herself Sarah and answered to Mrs. Bryce and hid her true identity from everyone around her. But she was not gone, and she was not buried, and she was living in the same house as him, and the knowledge of it was driving him slowly mad. On the 5th day of his visit, he finally saw her clearly. It was late afternoon, and the rain had returned, a steady drizzle that turned the light grey and soft. He had been reading in the library, or trying to read, and he had risen to stand by the window and watch the rain fall across the gardens. She had come out of the house through a side door, carrying a basket of linens, and she had paused on the threshold, looking up at the sky with an expression that he could not read. She was thinner than he remembered. That was the first thing he noticed. Her face had lost its youthful softness, and there were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of too little sleep and too much worry. Her hair was pinned back severely, with no adornment, and her dress was plain grey wool, with sleeves that had been turned and re-hemmed. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who worked for her living, and had been working for a long time. But her eyes were the same. Even at this distance, he could see that. They were still the warm brown he remembered, still bright with the intelligence that had first drawn him to her. And when she tilted her face up to the rain, closing her eyes for just a moment, something in the gesture was so familiar that it made his chest ache. He stood at the window and watched her, and he did not move, and she did not see him. After a few moments, she lowered her head and stepped out into the rain, walking quickly across the gravel toward the laundry buildings with the basket balanced against her hip. He watched until she disappeared from view, and then he turned away from the window and sat down heavily in the nearest chair. His hands were trembling, he realized. He looked down at them in disbelief, and then clasped them together in his lap, pressing them hard against his thighs to stop the shaking. This was ridiculous. He was not a lovesick boy anymore. He was a grown man, a duke, a man of substance and consequence, and he was not going to fall apart because he had seen a woman he had once loved and lost. But the truth was that he had never stopped loving her. He had simply learned to live with the pain, the way a man learns to live with an old injury that never quite heals. And now the pain had been torn open again, and he did not know how to close it. He remained in the library until the light faded and the servants came to light the lamps, and then he went to his rooms and dressed for dinner with hands that were not quite steady. Throughout the meal, he sat at Lord Harrington's table and made polite conversation and smiled at the appropriate moments, and all the while his mind was full of her. She had been standing in the rain, and she had closed her eyes, and for one unguarded moment she had looked exactly like the girl he had once planned to marry. That night, he made a decision. He would speak to her. He would find a way to approach her privately, without causing scandal or speculation, and he would ask her the questions that had been burning in his mind since the moment he had seen her from his window. He would ask her what had happened to her family, and why she was working as a servant, and whether the child was really the son of a dead soldier named Thomas Bailey. And he would tell her that he was sorry. He did not know if she would listen. He did not know if she would even agree to speak with him. But he had spent nearly a decade living with the weight of his own guilt, and he could not bear to spend another day under the same roof as her without attempting to make things right. The only question was how to approach her without drawing attention to either of them. In the end, it was easier than he had expected. The household at Norland Park was large enough that the movements of the servants attracted little notice, and Elizabeth's duties kept her largely in the east wing, away from the guests. On the 6th morning of his visit, he rose early and made his way to the kitchen garden, reasoning that she would eventually pass through on some errand or other. He positioned himself near the low stone wall that bordered the garden, partially concealed by a row of espaliered pear trees, and waited. It took nearly an hour, but eventually she appeared, carrying a basket and moving with the same quiet efficiency he had observed from a distance. She did not see him at first, and he had a moment to study her face before she became aware of his presence. She looked tired, he thought. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there before, and her mouth was set in a way that suggested she had learned to expect nothing good from the world. Then she looked up and saw him, and she stopped dead in the middle of the path. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Her face had gone very pale, and her hands had tightened on the basket, and he could see the rapid rise and fall of her breathing beneath the rough fabric of her dress. He had imagined this moment many times in the past few days, but none of his imaginings had prepared him for the reality of standing before her, close enough to see the pulse beating in her throat. "Elizabeth," he said. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She stared at him as though he were a ghost, and then she took a step backward, and another, and for one terrible moment he thought she was going to turn and run. "Please," he said quickly, "I only want to talk to you. Just for a few minutes. I will not keep you long." The sound of his voice seemed to break whatever spell had held her. She straightened, drawing herself up to her full height, and her expression hardened into something that was almost like anger. "Your Grace," she said, and the title was like a blade between them. "I have nothing to say to you. Elizabeth, please. I know this is unexpected. I know you have every right to refuse. But there are things I need to understand, and I think there are things you may wish to know as well. I have no wish to know anything from you, she said. Her voice was low but steady, and there was a finality in it that made his heart sink. And I have nothing to explain. Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to do. She moved to step around him, but he shifted to block her path. It was a desperate move, and he knew it, but he could not let her walk away. Not now. Not when he had finally found the courage to face her. The child, he said. The boy I saw in the garden. Is he yours? Her face went still, and he saw something flicker in her eyes that might have been fear. That is none of your concern, she said. I know it is not. I know I have no right to ask, but I need to know, Elizabeth. I need to know if there is any chance that he is mine. The fear in her eyes turned to fury, and she took a step toward him, her hands clenched at her sides. How dare you, she said, and her voice shook with the force of her anger. How dare you stand there and ask me that, after what you did? You have no right. You have no right to anything of mine, and you certainly have no right to my son. So he is your son? Yes, she said. He is my son, and his father is dead, and he has never known anything of you, and I would prefer to keep it that way. His father is dead, Everly repeated slowly, and his name was Thomas. She flinched, and he saw the confirmation in her eyes before she could hide it. She opened her mouth to speak, but he held up a hand to stop her. You named him after me, he said, and his voice was so quiet that he barely recognized it. You gave him my name. I gave him his father's name, she said, but the words came out too quickly, and he could see the panic rising in her. There was no soldier, he said. There was no Thomas Bailey, was there? She did not answer. Her face was white now, and her hands were trembling, and she looked as though she might collapse at any moment. He wanted to reach out to her, to steady her, but he did not dare touch her. Elizabeth, he said, please, tell me the truth. Is he mine? For a long, terrible moment, she said nothing. Then she closed her eyes, and a single tear slipped down her cheek, and she nodded. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. He took a step backward, reaching out to brace himself against the stone wall, and for several seconds he could not breathe. A child, a son, his son. The woman he had never stopped loving had borne his child, and he had not known. He had spent years living without them, years believing that she had gone to Scotland and made a new life for herself, when all the while she had been raising his son in secret, hiding him from the world, protecting him from the shame of his own birth. He did not know what to feel. There was joy in it, and grief, and a fury so deep that it threatened to consume him. He wanted to shout at her, to demand an explanation, to ask her how she could have kept this from him. But even as the anger rose in him, he understood. She had kept the child a secret because she had believed he would not want it, because he had rejected her, and she had no reason to think he would treat their child any differently. She had done what she thought was necessary to protect her son, and she had done it alone, without his help or support. The realization was almost more than he could bear. Why did you not tell me? He asked, and his voice cracked on the words. Why did you not write to me? I would have done something. I would have married you. I would have acknowledged him. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and the expression in her eyes was the saddest thing he had ever seen. Would you? She said. You made it very clear that you could not marry me. You told me that your family's situation required you to marry a woman of fortune, and that I could not be that woman. What was I supposed to think? That you would set aside all your obligations because I was carrying your child? That you would risk your family's future for a woman you had already rejected? I did not reject you, he said. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. He had rejected her. He had sat across from her in that posting inn and told her that he could not marry her, and he had watched her walk away, and he had not followed her. That was a rejection, no matter what words he had used to soften it. You did, she said quietly, and I understood. I really did. I knew what your duty required, and I did not blame you for it. But I could not stay in Yorkshire, not when I was carrying your child, and everyone in the county would have known it. So I told my parents that I was going to visit relatives in Scotland, and I went to Lady Westmoreland instead. She had always been kind to me, and I knew she would help me. And she did, Everly said. It was not a question. She did, Elizabeth confirmed. She took me in, and she kept my secret, and when Tom was born, she helped me find work. I have been in service ever since. It is not the life I would have chosen, but it is honest work, and it has kept a roof over my son's head. Everly closed his eyes. The full weight of what she was telling him settled over him like a shroud, and he felt the old familiar guilt rise up from the place where he had buried it so many years ago. He had done this. He had set this chain of events in motion, and she had paid the price for it. "I am sorry," he said. "I am more sorry than I can ever say. But I am here now, and I want to make this right. I want to know my son. I want to give him the life he should have had. And I want to give you the life you should have had." She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw the wariness in her eyes, the refusal to believe that anything he said could be trusted. "It is too late for that," she said. "You cannot undo what has been done. You cannot give Tom back the years he has already lost, and I do not want your charity, Your Grace. I have managed well enough on my own." "I am not offering charity," he said. "I am offering you what is rightfully yours, what is rightfully his. He is my son, Elizabeth. He is my heir. Do you understand what that means?" She went very still. "He is not your heir," she said. "He cannot be. He is illegitimate." "I am a duke," Everly said. "I can do a great many things that ordinary men cannot. I can acknowledge him. I can provide for him. I can give him an education, and a position, and a future. And if necessary, I will have the necessary legal arrangements made to establish Tom's rightful place within my family, and secure his inheritance." Elizabeth shook her head slowly. "Even if that were possible, it would not be so simple. There would be a scandal. There would be questions. And what would become of your family's reputation? What would become of the estate?" "I do not care about the estate," he said, and he was surprised to realize that he meant it. "I have spent my entire life caring about the estate, and the estate has given me nothing but loneliness. My father died for it. My mother sacrificed her happiness for it. I will not let it take my son from me too." There was a long silence. Elizabeth looked at him, and he looked at her, and the distance between them felt insurmountable, even though they were standing only a few feet apart. He could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear, the stubborn pride that had kept her going through all the difficult years. She did not trust him, and he could not blame her for that. But she had not refused him outright. That was something. "I am not asking you to make any decisions today," he said at last. "I am only asking you to think about it, to consider what might be possible. We are both staying under the same roof for another week at least. That gives us time to talk, to figure out what we want to do next." "There is nothing to figure out," Elizabeth said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "You are a duke, and I am a maid. There is no future in which the two of us can simply pick up where we left off." "I am not asking to pick up where we left off," he said. "I am asking for a chance to know my son, and perhaps, in time, to earn back some small measure of your good opinion. That is all." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head and turned away, and this time he did not try to stop her. "I cannot give you that," she said over her shoulder. "Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But I will think about what you have said." She walked away, and he stood in the kitchen garden and watched her go, and the rain began to fall again, soft and steady, as though the sky itself was weeping for everything that had been lost between them. He did not see her again that day, or the next, and he began to wonder if she intended to avoid him for the remainder of his stay. But on the third day after their conversation in the garden, he received a note delivered to his room by one of the housemaids. It was brief, written in a hand he did not recognize, and it read simply, "Meet me by the lake at dusk, bring no one." He read the note twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his waistcoat pocket. His heart was beating too fast, and there was a strange lightness in his chest that he had not felt in years. She had agreed to see him. She had not shut him out entirely. It was a beginning, however small. He spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous anticipation, counting the hours until evening. He attended dinner with the other guests and made conversation that he could not remember afterward, and when the meal was finally over, he excused himself as early as he decently could and made his way down to the lake. The water was grey in the fading light, and the air was cool and damp. He stood at the edge of the lake, watching the surface ripple in the breeze, and waited. The minutes stretched on, and he began to fear that she would not come. But then he heard footsteps on the gravel behind him, and he turned to see her approaching through the dusk. She was wearing a dark cloak over her maid's dress, and her face was partly hidden by the hood, but he would have recognized her walk anywhere. She stopped a few feet away from him, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. "I did not think you would come," he said. "I almost did not," she replied. "But I have been thinking about what you said, and I realized that there are things I need to know." "I will tell you anything you wish to know," he said. She nodded slowly, then lowered her hood so that he could see her face. The fading light softened the lines of her features, and for a moment she looked almost like the girl he had known all those years ago. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "To Norland Park, I mean. Was it because of me? Did you know I was here?" "No," he said. "I had no idea you were here. Lord Harrington invited me months ago, and I accepted without any thought of seeing you. It was pure chance that brought us together again." She seemed to consider this. "And when you saw me," she said, "when you recognized me from your window that first morning, what did you feel?" The question caught him off guard. He had expected her to ask about practical matters, the child, the inheritance, the legal questions that would need to be addressed. But this was something else entirely. "I felt as though I had seen a ghost," he said slowly. "A ghost of the only woman I have ever loved." She flinched, and he saw the quick flash of pain in her eyes before she looked away. He had not meant to hurt her, but the words had come out before he could stop them, and he did not regret them. She deserved to know the truth. "You cannot say things like that," she said quietly. "Not after everything that has happened." "I can say them because they are true," he said. "I have spent nearly a decade trying to convince myself that I did not love you, that what we had was a youthful infatuation that would have faded in time. But seeing you again has made me realize that I was lying to myself. I have never stopped loving you, Elizabeth, not for one single day." She shook her head, and he saw the glimmer of tears in her eyes. "It does not matter," she said. "Love was never enough. It was not enough then, and it is not enough now." "It could be," he said, "if we are both willing to fight for it." "What is there to fight for?" she demanded. "You are the Duke of Everley. You move in circles I can never enter. Even if you acknowledged Tom, even if you provided for him, I would still be a servant. I would still be the woman who worked as a maid in the house of Lord Harrington. Do you think your friends would accept that? Do you think society would accept it?" "I do not care what society accepts," he said. "I have spent my entire life doing what society expected of me, and it has brought me nothing but misery. I am tired of it, Elizabeth. I am tired of living my life according to the rules of people who do not know me and do not care about my happiness." "That is easy to say now," she said. "But when the scandal breaks, when the whispers start, when your family and your political allies turn their backs on you, will you still feel the same way?" "Yes," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice. "I will. Because I will have you, and I will have my son, and that is worth more to me than any title or estate could ever be." She stared at him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The lake rippled in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out across the water. "You do not know what you are asking," she said at last. "You do not know what you are asking," she said at last. "You do not know what you are asking," she said at last. "You do not know what you are asking," she said at last. "You do not know what you are asking," she said at last. "You do not know what you are asking." She was silent for a long time. He could see the conflict in her face, the war between the part of her that wanted to believe him, and the part of her that had been hurt too deeply to trust again. He wanted to reach out and take her hand, but he did not dare. This was her choice to make, and he could not make it for her. Finally, she said, "I need time. I need to think about what is best for Tom. He is all I have, and I will not do anything that might hurt him." "Of course," he said. "Take whatever time you need. I will not pressure you. But know this, Elizabeth. I will not walk away this time. Whatever you decide, I will still be here. I will still want to know my son, and I will still love you." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded once and turned away, disappearing into the darkness as quietly as she had come. He stood by the lake for a long time after she had gone, staring out at the water and thinking about the years he had lost and the years he might still have. The future was uncertain, and there were no guarantees that anything would work out as he hoped. But for the first time in nearly a decade, he felt something that was very much like hope. The days that followed were strange and difficult. Elizabeth kept her distance, and he did not approach her, respecting the space she had asked for. But he could not stop thinking about her, and he could not stop thinking about the boy with the dark curly hair and the gap-toothed smile who was his son. He watched the child from a distance whenever he could, careful not to draw attention to himself. Tom was often in the kitchen garden or the stables, playing with the other servant children, or following the grooms around with the wide-eyed curiosity of a boy his age. He seemed happy enough, Everly thought, though there was a certain guardedness in the way he held himself that suggested he had already learned that the world was not always kind. It broke Everly's heart to see it. He wanted to go to the boy, to introduce himself, to tell him that he had a father who cared about him, but he knew that such an introduction would be premature. Elizabeth had not yet made up her mind about what she wanted, and he could not undermine her authority by approaching Tom without her permission. So he waited, and he tried to be patient, and he threw himself into the social obligations of the house party with as much enthusiasm as he could manage. It was on the 6th day after their conversation by the lake that everything changed. He was in the library, pretending to read, when the door opened and Elizabeth came in. She was not wearing her maid's dress. Instead, she wore a simple but respectable gown of dark blue wool, and her hair was arranged more carefully than he had seen it since his arrival. She looked nervous, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, but there was a determination in her face that he recognized. "I have made my decision," she said. He set aside his book and rose to his feet, his heart pounding. "And what have you decided?" "I have decided that I will allow you to meet your son," she said. "But there are conditions." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "You will not tell him that you are his father," she said. "Not yet. He is too young to understand the full implications, and I will not have him confused or frightened by revelations he cannot comprehend. You may introduce yourself as a friend of the family, nothing more." "I understand," he said. "You will not try to remove him from my care," she continued. "Whatever happens between us, he is my son, and I will not give him up. If you wish to provide for him, that is your choice. But you must accept that I will continue to be his mother and his primary caretaker." "I would never try to take him from you," he said. "That is not what I want." "And you will make no public announcement until we have both agreed on the terms," she said. "Acknowledging him will have consequences for both of us, and I will not be rushed into anything before I am ready." "Agreed," he said. She let out a long breath, and some of the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease. "Very well," she said. "If you wish to meet him, he is in the kitchen garden. He will be there for another half-hour at least." Everly stood very still, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "You are certain?" he asked. Elizabeth nodded. "I am certain," she said. "He has been asking about you actually. He saw you walking by the stables the other day and wanted to know who you were. I told him you were a guest of the family." "And what did he say to that?" A small, reluctant smile touched her lips. "He said you looked like someone important. He has always had a good eye for that sort of thing." Everly felt something warm bloom in his chest. "Then I suppose I should go and introduce myself," he said. Elizabeth nodded again, and for a moment their eyes met, and he saw something in her face that he had not seen since the day she had walked out of the posting inn. It was not forgiveness. Not yet, perhaps not ever, but it was something softer than the cold wariness that had been there before. "Be patient with him," she said quietly. "He is a good boy, but he can be shy with strangers." "I will be patient," Everly promised. "I have waited a long time for this. I can wait a little longer." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and left the room without another word. He stood there for several seconds, collecting himself, and then he made his way through the house and out into the kitchen garden. The afternoon was cool but clear, the clouds of the previous days having finally broken, and the light was soft and golden. He could see the boy sitting on the same upturned bucket where he had first seen him, poking at the dirt with a stick. Tom looked up as he approached, and his face brightened with recognition. "You're the Duke," he said. "I am," Everly said, and he was surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "And you are Tom, if I remember correctly." The boy nodded, grinning. "That's right," he said. "Tom Bailey. Did you come to see the garden? The carrots are nearly ready to pull, but Mrs. Pike says I'm not allowed to touch them until she says so." "I came to see you, actually," Everly said. "Your mother told me you might like some company." Tom's eyes widened. "My mama?" he said. "You know my mama?" "I do," Everly said. "I have known her for a very long time." The boy considered this information with the same serious expression he had worn during their first conversation. "She never mentioned you," he said. "That does not surprise me," Everly said. "But I hope that can change. I would like to be a friend to you, Tom, and to your mother as well." Tom studied him for a long moment, and then he shrugged and returned his attention to the dirt. "You can sit down if you want," he said. "But there's only the one bucket, and I'm using it." Everly laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised him with its ease. "Then I shall sit on the wall," he said. And he did, lowering himself onto the low stone barrier that bordered the garden. It was not the most dignified perch for a duke, but he found that he did not care. They sat together in companionable silence for a while, the boy poking at the dirt and occasionally exclaiming over some insect or stone that he found, and Everly watching him with a hunger that he did his best to hide. Up close, he could see the traces of Elizabeth in the boy's features, the shape of his mouth, the arch of his brows, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking. But there was also something else, something that Everly recognized with a jolt as a reflection of his own face. The boy had his nose. His exact nose, the same slightly aquiline curve that appeared in the family portraits at Everly Hall, and his hands, long-fingered and elegant, even at this young age, were the hands of the Everly line. How had he not seen it before? How had he spent an entire conversation with this child and not recognized his own features staring back at him? Because he had not wanted to see it, he realized. Because acknowledging the truth would have meant confronting everything he had lost, and he had not been ready to do that. But he was ready now. "Tom," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "May I ask you something?" The boy looked up. "What is it? What do you know about your father?" Tom's face grew solemn, and he set aside his stick. "Mama says he was a soldier," he said. "She says he was very brave and very good, but he died before I was born. She says he's in heaven now, watching over us." Everly felt his throat tighten. "That is what your mother told you?" Tom nodded. "She says I have his name, Thomas. She says it's a good name, a strong name, and I should be proud of it." "She is right," Everly said. "It is a good name." The boy smiled, and the gap in his teeth made him look so young and so vulnerable that Everly had to look away for a moment to compose himself. They talked for a while longer, about the garden and the horses and the various small adventures of a boy's life, and by the time the shadows began to lengthen across the garden, Everly knew that his life had changed irrevocably. He was a father now, not in name, not yet, but in his heart, and he would spend the rest of his days trying to make up for the years he had missed. When he finally rose to leave, Tom scrambled to his feet and stood looking up at him with an expression of barely suppressed hope. "Will you come again?" the boy asked. "Tomorrow, I mean. It's nice to have someone to talk to." Everly felt something crack inside him, and he had to swallow hard before he could answer. "I would like that very much," he said, "if your mother permits it." Tom's face fell slightly. "Mama is always working," he said. "She doesn't have much time to talk to me, but she's a good mama." "She is," Everly agreed. "She is the best of women." The boy nodded, apparently satisfied, and then he picked up his stick and returned to his poking with renewed vigor. Everly watched him for a moment longer, and then he turned and walked back toward the house, his heart full to bursting. That night, he found Elizabeth in the servants' hall, helping the cook prepare the evening meal. She looked up when he entered, and her expression was guarded, but there was a question in her eyes that she did not voice. "He is a remarkable boy," Everly said quietly, standing in the doorway. "You have raised him well." Elizabeth's hands stilled over the bowl she was holding. "Thank you," she said. and her voice was barely above a whisper. "I would like to see him again tomorrow," he said. "With your permission." She was silent for a long moment, and then she nodded once. "You have it," she said. "But remember your promise. He is not to know the truth until we are both ready to tell him." "I remember," Everly said, "and I will keep my word. But there is something else I must ask of you." She looked at him warily. "What is it?" "I would like you to consider coming to London with me," he said. "Not as a servant, but as the mother of my son. I can find you a house, a proper establishment, where you and Tom can live comfortably, while we work out the legal arrangements for his acknowledgement." Elizabeth's face tightened. "I cannot accept that," she said. "It would not be proper. People would talk." "People will talk regardless," he said. "But I can protect you from the worst of it. You and Tom would have a home of your own, with servants of your own. You would want for nothing." "I have never wanted much," she said. "Only a safe place for my son, and enough work to keep us fed. I do not need your charity." "It is not charity," he said, and there was a note of frustration in his voice that he could not entirely suppress. "It is my responsibility. You are carrying the burden of my choices, Elizabeth, and I cannot stand by and watch it happen any longer. Let me help you. Let me do what I should have done years ago." She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw the indecision in her eyes. She was proud, and she had learned to rely only on herself, and accepting his help would mean surrendering some small part of the independence she had fought so hard to preserve. But she was also exhausted, and she was afraid, and she knew as well as he did, that raising an illegitimate child in service was not a future she could sustain forever. "I will think about it," she said at last. "That is all I can promise." He nodded and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him at the door. "Everly," she said, and the sound of his name on her lips made something inside him ache. "Thank you for being kind to him." He turned back to look at her, and for a moment the years fell away, and he saw the girl he had loved standing in the doorway of his mother's parlor, laughing at something he had said. The memory was so vivid that it stole his breath. "He is my son," he said. "I will always be kind to him." And then he walked away, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen with her thoughts. The next 2 weeks were the strangest and most wonderful of Everly's life. Each day, he spent an hour or more with Tom in the kitchen garden, or the stables, listening to the boy's endless questions, and answering them as best he could. He learned that Tom was fascinated by horses, and had a particular fondness for a small grey pony in Lord Harrington's stables, that he was learning his letters from one of the stable hands, and could already write his own name, and that he had a remarkable memory for the stories his mother told him at bedtime. He learned that Tom was brave and curious, and occasionally mischievous, that he had a temper when he was tired, and a sweetness when he was content, and that he laughed in exactly the same way his mother had laughed when she was young and carefree. And as the days passed, he began to see changes in Elizabeth as well. She was still wary of him, still guarded, but the sharp edge of her hostility had softened, and she no longer avoided him when their paths crossed. They spoke occasionally, always about Tom or practical matters, and he sensed that she was watching him carefully, waiting to see if he would keep his promises. He did. He kept every promise he had made, and he did not push for more than she was willing to give. It was difficult. There were moments when he wanted nothing more than to take her in his arms and tell her everything that was in his heart. But he forced himself to be patient, to wait for her to come to him. And then, on the last day of his visit, she did. He was standing in the library, staring out at the rain, when he heard the door open behind him. He turned and saw her standing in the doorway, and something about the expression on her face made his heart stop. "I have made another decision," she said. He waited, not daring to speak. "I will come to London," she said. "Tom and I, if your offer still stands." He crossed the room in 3 strides, and took her hands in his before he could stop himself. "Of course it still stands," he said. "Of course it does." She looked down at their joined hands, and then she looked up at him, and he saw the glimmer of tears in her eyes. "I am trusting you," she said. "I have spent a long time learning not to trust anyone, and I am trusting you with the most precious thing in my life. If you betray that trust, I will take him and disappear, and you will never see either of us again." "I understand," he said, "and I will not betray you. I swear it on my honor as a duke, and on my love for you and for our son." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she nodded, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. He reached up and brushed it away with his thumb, and the touch was so tender, so intimate, that it made both of them catch their breath. "We have a long road ahead of us," she said. "There will be difficulties and scandals, and people who will try to tear us apart." "Let them try," he said. "They will not succeed. I have waited too long for this to let anyone take it away from me." She smiled then, a real smile, the first he had seen from her since the days of their courtship, and the sight of it filled him with a joy so fierce that he felt he might burst. The arrangements took several weeks to make. Everly wrote to his solicitor in London, instructing him to find a suitable house in a quiet, respectable neighborhood where Elizabeth and Tom could live while the legal matters were sorted out. He wrote to his mother as well, a long and carefully worded letter in which he explained the situation and asked for her support. The Dowager Duchess's reply arrived 10 days later, and it was shorter than he had expected, but warmer than he had dared to hope. "Bring them to me," she had written. "I have grieved for years over what was lost, and I will not lose my grandson now." So, when the house party at Norland Park came to an end, Everly did not return to Yorkshire alone. His carriage travelled south with 3 passengers, one of them a small boy who pressed his face to the window and exclaimed over every horse and carriage and roadside inn they passed, and the other a woman who sat quietly in the corner of the seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the countryside roll by with an expression that was part hope and part fear. They stopped for the night at a posting inn halfway between Lord Harrington's estate and London, and Everly arranged for 2 private rooms, one for Elizabeth and Tom, and one for himself. It was not proper for them to be travelling together, he knew, and there would be talk regardless of what precautions he took, but he had made his choice, and he would not apologize for it. That evening, after Tom had been put to bed, Elizabeth came down to the private parlour where Everly was sitting. She had changed out of her travelling dress and was wearing a simple gown of soft grey, and her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked so beautiful that he forgot to breathe for a moment. "I could not sleep," she said. "Tom fell asleep almost immediately, but my mind is too full of thoughts." "Come and sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite his. "We can talk if you like, or we can simply sit in silence, whatever you prefer." She sat down, smoothing her skirts with nervous hands. "I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong," she admitted. "What if your solicitor cannot do what he promised? What if the petition for legitimacy is denied? What if—" "Elizabeth," he said gently, "we will face each difficulty as it comes. But for tonight, let us not borrow trouble from tomorrow. We have already survived the worst of it, you and I. Nothing that lies ahead can be harder than what we have already endured." She looked at him, and he saw the uncertainty in her eyes begin to ease. "You always did know how to calm me," she said. "Even when everything felt impossible, you could make me believe that it would work out somehow." "And it will," he said. "It will work out, because we will make it work. Together." They sat together in the parlour for a long time, talking quietly about small things, about Tom's progress with his letters, about the house Everly had instructed his solicitor to find, about the weather and the roads, and the 1,000 mundane details of travel. But beneath the surface of their conversation, something else was happening, something that neither of them acknowledged aloud. They were learning each other again. Slowly, carefully, they were rebuilding the connection that had been severed so many years ago, and with each passing moment, Everly felt the distance between them shrink. When Elizabeth finally rose to go to bed, she paused at the door and looked back at him. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you have done." "I have done very little," he said, "but I intend to spend the rest of my life doing more." She smiled, and then she was gone, leaving him alone in the parlour, with the embers of the fire, and the knowledge that, for the first time in nearly a decade, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The house in London was modest by ducal standards, but it was clean and well appointed, with a small garden in the back and a nursery on the second floor that Tom immediately claimed as his own. Elizabeth had been hesitant about accepting the arrangement at first, but when she saw the look on her son's face as he explored his new room, the hesitation faded. "It is too much," she said quietly, standing in the doorway of the nursery, while Tom bounced on the bed. "He does not need so much space. He does not need so many things. He needs a home," Everly said. "And so do you." She turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that he could not read. "What about you?" she asked. "Where is your home?" He thought about the vast echoing rooms of Everly Hall, the cold grandeur of his London residence, the long years of loneliness that had filled both places. "I have not had a home for a very long time," he said. "But I think I am beginning to understand what one might look like." The weeks that followed were busy but peaceful. Everly's solicitor, a sharp-eyed man by the name of Mr. Wexley, began the process of drafting the legal documents that would acknowledge Tom as Everly's natural son. It was a delicate business, involving questions of inheritance and succession that would need to be resolved carefully, but Wexley assured him that it could be done. "There is precedent," Wexley said, shuffling through a stack of papers on his desk. "It will take time, and there will be costs, but the law does allow for such acknowledgements in certain circumstances. If we can demonstrate that the child has been raised under your protection, and that no other man has claimed paternity, the petition should be accepted." Everly nodded, but his mind was only half on the legal details. The rest of it was back at the house in Bloomsbury, where Elizabeth was unpacking their few belongings, and Tom was exploring every corner of his new home. "There is one more thing," he said. "I want to make provision for the boy's mother as well. A settlement, in her own name, so that she will never be dependent on anyone else's goodwill again." Wexley raised his eyebrows but made no comment. "That can be arranged," he said. "I will draw up the papers." The settlement was a generous one, enough to ensure that Elizabeth would want for nothing for the rest of her life, whether or not she chose to remain in Everly's orbit. He had not discussed the amount with her, and he did not intend to. It was not a gift, he told himself. It was a debt, one that he had owed her for nearly a decade, and had only now begun to repay. But when he presented the papers to her one evening after Tom had gone to bed, she stared at him in disbelief. "This is too much," she said. "I cannot accept this." "You can, and you will," he said. "It is yours by right, Elizabeth. You are the mother of my son, and you have sacrificed everything to raise him. This is the least I can do." She shook her head, but he saw the tears gathering in her eyes. "I did not do it for money," she said. "I did it because I loved him, because he was all I had left of you." The words hit him like a blow, and he had to steady himself against the back of a chair. "I know," he said, "and I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve what you have given me." Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Elizabeth stood and crossed the room to where he was standing, and she took his face in her hands and kissed him. It was not a chaste kiss, and it was not a tentative one. It was a kiss that carried years of grief and longing and pent-up desire, a kiss that spoke of all the things they had never been able to say to each other. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close, and she melted into him, and for the first time in nearly a decade, the aching emptiness inside him began to fill. When they finally broke apart, both of them were trembling. Elizabeth's cheeks were flushed, and her lips were parted, and she looked up at him with an expression of such raw vulnerability that it made his heart clench. "I have wanted to do that for a very long time," she admitted. "So have I," he said. "More than you could possibly know." They stood together in the quiet room, holding each other, and the world outside, with all its judgments and complications and inevitable scandals, seemed very far away. The scandal, when it came, was not as bad as Everly had feared. There were whispers, of course, and a few pointed questions from those who had known him in his youth. But he had been careful in his handling of the matter, and the fact that he had not attempted to hide the situation worked in his favor. He introduced Elizabeth to society gradually, first as a family friend, then as the mother of his acknowledged son, and finally, when the worst of the speculation had died down, as his intended bride. The announcement of their engagement caused a stir, but not the uproar that Elizabeth had anticipated. By then, the story had already circulated through the drawing rooms of London, and most people had concluded that the Duke of Everley was simply a man who had chosen to do the honorable thing, even if he had been slow about it. There were a few who sneered, and a few who refused to receive them, but by and large, society proved more forgiving than either of them had expected. The Dowager Duchess, to everyone's surprise, became Elizabeth's fiercest defender. The old woman had been cold at their first meeting, her disapproval evident in every line of her face. But then Tom had walked into the room, had looked up at the stern old woman with his mother's brown eyes, and had asked, in a clear, carrying voice, "Are you my grandmother?" The Duchess had stared at him for a long moment, and then she had done something no one had expected. She had knelt down on the carpet, right there in the middle of her elegant drawing room, and opened her arms. "Yes," she had said, and her voice had cracked. "Yes, I am your grandmother, and I have been waiting to meet you for a very long time." That had been the turning point. After that, the Duchess had thrown her support behind the engagement with the full force of her considerable influence, and the rest of society had followed her lead. The wedding took place in a small church in Mayfair, with only a handful of close friends and family in attendance. Tom served as ring-bearer, walking down the aisle with the ring clutched in both hands and an expression of intense concentration on his face, and the Dowager Duchess wept openly throughout the entire ceremony. Elizabeth wore a gown of ivory silk, and she carried a bouquet of white roses and lavender, and when Everley saw her walking toward him down the aisle, he felt tears prick at his own eyes. She was beautiful, more beautiful than she had ever been, and she was smiling, and she was his. The vows were spoken, the ring was exchanged, and when the clergyman pronounced them man and wife, Everley pulled Elizabeth into his arms and kissed her with a passion that made the Dowager Duchess exclaim in mock outrage, and Tom cover his eyes with both hands. "That's not proper, Papa," Tom said, peeking through his fingers. "Mama says people shouldn't kiss in public." Elizabeth laughed, a bright, joyful sound that seemed to light up the whole church. "I think we can make an exception for a wedding," she said. "Don't you?" Tom considered this, then nodded solemnly. "I suppose so," he said, "but only this once." The reception was held at Everley's London residence, and it was there that the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Mr. Wexley arrived halfway through the festivities, carrying a leather satchel stuffed with documents, and drew Everley aside with a grave expression. "The necessary legal arrangements have been completed," he said quietly. "Tom's place within the family is formally established, and his inheritance has been secured." Everley closed his eyes and let out a long breath. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for everything." Wexley nodded, then glanced across the room to where Tom was sitting on his grandmother's lap, listening with wide eyes as she told him a story about his father's boyhood adventures. "He seems like a good boy," the solicitor said. "You are fortunate." "I know," Everley said. "More fortunate than I deserve." He found Elizabeth a few minutes later, standing by the window with a glass of champagne in her hand. She turned as he approached, and the smile on her face faded slightly when she saw his expression. "What is it?" she asked. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," he said. "Everything is right, for the first time in my life." He took her hand and led her away from the other guests, into a quiet corner where they could speak privately. "The necessary arrangements have been completed," he said. "Tom is formally recognized as my son, and his future and inheritance are secured. Everything we fought for is settled." Elizabeth stared at him, and then her face crumpled, and she began to cry. He pulled her into his arms and held her while she wept, great heaving sobs that seemed to release years of fear and tension and uncertainty. He held her until the crying subsided, and then he tilted her chin up and kissed her gently. "It is over," he said. "The secrecy, the hiding, the fear, it is all over. From this day forward, you and Tom will never have to hide again." She nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know," she said. "It just does not feel real yet. I kept thinking that something would go wrong, that the petition would be denied, or the scandal would destroy us." "The scandal did not destroy us," he said. "It made us stronger, and the petition was granted because the law, for once, recognized what was right. You are my wife now, Elizabeth. Tom is my son, and nothing and no one can ever take that away from us." She smiled up at him, and the smile was watery but genuine. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you for so long that I do not remember what it felt like to live without it." "And I love you," he said, "more than I have ever loved anything in this world, more than I ever thought myself capable of loving." They stood together in the quiet corner, holding each other, while the sounds of the wedding celebration swirled around them. Somewhere in the room, Tom's laughter rang out, bright and joyful, and the sound of it filled Everly's heart to overflowing. He had been given a second chance, he thought, a chance to undo the mistakes of his past and build something new from the ruins. He had been given a son, and a wife, and a future that stretched out before him like a road leading toward the horizon. He did not intend to waste a single moment of it. The years that followed were not without their challenges. The estate took time to rebuild, and there were seasons when the harvest failed or the markets turned against them. The political world shifted beneath his feet, and there were moments when he wondered whether his influence in Parliament was worth the endless maneuvering it required. And there were still those in society who looked at Elizabeth and saw only the servant she had once been, rather than the Duchess she had become. But through all of it, they faced the world together, and that made all the difference. Tom grew into a strong, intelligent young man, the kind of son any father would be proud to claim. He attended the best schools, made the right connections, and showed every sign of becoming a capable steward of the Everly estates when the time came. But more importantly, he grew into a kind and honorable man, one who treated servants with respect and never forgot where he had come from. And Elizabeth flourished. The years of hardship had left their marks on her, but as the seasons passed, those marks began to fade. She laughed more often, slept more deeply, and carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had finally found her place in the world. She took charge of the household with efficiency and grace, earning the respect of the servants and the admiration of their peers. And at night, when the house was quiet, and the children, for there were more children now, 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl, were asleep in their beds, she would sit with Everly in the library and talk about the small events of the day, and he would look at her and wonder how he had ever been foolish enough to let her go. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, they returned to the church in Mayfair, where they had been married. The building was empty, except for the 2 of them and the clergyman who had performed the ceremony a decade before, and the afternoon light streamed through the windows in shafts of gold. "Do you remember what you said to me that day?" Elizabeth asked as they stood together at the altar. "I remember," Everly said. "I said that I would spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. And have you succeeded?" He turned to look at her, at the grey threads now woven through her dark hair, and the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, and he smiled. "No," he said. "I do not think any man could deserve what you have given me. But I have tried, every single day, to be worthy of it." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "You have done better than that," she said. "You have made me happy, happier than I ever believed possible." He leaned down and kissed her, there in the quiet church where they had said their vows, and he felt the weight of the past decade fall away from his shoulders. The guilt and the grief and the long, lonely years of separation, all of it had been transformed by the simple, ordinary miracle of love. They walked out of the church together, hand in hand, into the golden afternoon. The carriage was waiting for them at the curb, and somewhere in the distance, the bells of London were ringing. "Where would you like to go?" Everly asked as he helped her into the carriage. Elizabeth settled back against the seat and smiled at him, and the smile was the same one she had given him on the day they had first met, so many years ago. "Home," she said. "Take me home." And he did. And there you have it. A love that was nearly lost forever. A secret child hidden from a duke who never stopped loving her. And a second chance that was earned through pain, patience, and forgiveness. But now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Elizabeth was right to keep Tom a secret from the Duke for all those years? Or should she have told him the truth the moment she knew she was carrying his child, no matter the consequences? And what about the Duke himself? Some of you may feel he doesn't deserve a happy ending after the way he rejected her. Others may believe he spent years paying for one impossible decision. Which side do you fall on? I read every comment, and I love hearing your theories, your reactions, and your debates. Let me know what you think below. And if you believe, even for a moment, that true love deserves a second chance, leave a like on this video so more people can find this story. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another historical romance.